We don't need objective morality. I've argued in a previous video that belief in God does not provide a ground for objective morality. I'll leave a link to the earlier video below. And I certainly stick by that here. But today I'm going to go even further and argue that there's no such thing as objective morality, nor do we need it. If you argue that morality is based on the will of God, this is most definitely not an objective morality. It's not based on anything objective, but rather on what God determines at any particular time and place. Even if God were to decide that the same moral rules and values would apply at all times, everywhere, this would still not represent an objective morality. It would only do so if God is appealing to some objective set of principles external to their own will. Otherwise, this morality is entirely subjective. It just so happens that the subject that determines these rules and values is God. If morality is grounded only in the will of God, then right and wrong can change according to time, place, and circumstances, as God wills. If it can't change, if God can't decide to change the rules, then God is bound by this objective morality, but cannot therefore form its basis. And if this objective basis for morality exists outside the will of God, then I don't have to depend upon God for this. I can actually challenge God's behaviour, just as I can challenge the behaviour of any individual if I think their behaviour does not conform to these objective moral standards. If a theist won't permit me to do that, if they cling instead to the idea that right and wrong derive entirely from the will of God, then they cannot claim that this morality is objective. This dilemma was posited thousands of years ago by Socrates via Plato, very succinctly in his book Euthyphro. Socrates asked the question, is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? If moral truths are good because God commands them, then morality is arbitrary and dependent on God's will. God could hypothetically decree acts like theft or cruelty to be moral. And indeed, in the Bible, he seems to do just that. On the other hand, if God commands something because it is good, then goodness exists independently of God, and divine commands are unnecessary for establishing moral truths. Let's look more closely at the characteristics of what would usually be regarded as objective morality. There are three conditions that it needs to meet. First, universal validity. The principles need to apply to all people at all times and in all places. The second is independence. Moral truths exist independently of individual or collective human opinions. Thirdly, immutability. The principles do not change over time or due to societal evolution. I would argue that no such thing as objective morality ever has or ever will exist. Can you name one single moral principle that indisputably meets these criteria: universal validity, independence, and immutability? I asked ChatGPT this question, and it came up with, it is wrong to cause unnecessary suffering to sentient beings. Does this meet the criterion of universal validity? To quote ChatGPT, causing unnecessary suffering is widely condemned across cultures, religions, and ethical systems. While the specific definition of unnecessary may vary, the principle itself seems broadly accepted. Widely condemned, note, not universally condemned. Broadly accepted, not universally accepted. Now, ChatGPT raises the question of how to interpret unnecessary, but it doesn't ask about sentience. What is meant by sentience? And why only sentient beings anyway? Nor is it entirely clear what would constitute suffering. And did you know that here in Australia, you don't need ethical approval to carry out experiments of any kind at all on insects, because very conveniently, they're not included in the category of animal. What about the criterion of independence then? ChatGPT says, philosophers, like utilitarians, argue that this principle is grounded in the nature of suffering itself, rather than in individual or societal opinions. The intrinsic badness of suffering is not thought to depend on whether someone believes it is bad. This statement is based on an analytical kind of truth, namely that bad is contained in the very meaning of the word suffering. We call something suffering rather than something neutral, such as reacting, because we presuppose that it is bad. In order to determine whether something is suffering, we observe its behavior. If it appears to be behaving in a way that seems similar to the way in which we behave when we subjectively experience suffering, we interpret the other being as suffering, unless maybe it's an insect. This, of course, is highly subjective. And there are Christians who argue that animal suffering is not part of the problem of evil in the world, precisely because, they say, animals don't suffer the way that we do. Yes, there are Christians who actively argue that, such as William Lane Craig. Okay, well, what about the criterion of immutability? Again, according to ChatGPT, this principle has been recognized across history and cultures. Even as societies evolve, the wrongness of unnecessary suffering remains a consistent theme, whether in ancient religious texts, Enlightenment philosophy, or contemporary human and animal rights movements. Does it, though? The wrongness of unnecessary suffering remains a consistent theme? In fact, it seems to me that many societies have been completely indifferent to the suffering of animals, sometimes even viewing this as entertainment. And at times, inflicting as much suffering as possible on your enemies has been viewed as a good thing, something praiseworthy. My point here is not to raise up ChatGPT as the ultimate arbiter of morality, nor is it to defend or attack this particular ethical principle. My point is that no matter what supposedly objective moral principle you or ChatGPT can come up with, it will be possible to challenge it on the grounds of some or all of these criteria: universal validity, independence, and immutability. And if you do come up with a principle that meets all these criteria, I suspect it will be so vague and general that it will have no practical application at all. Something like, do good stuff. There's no such thing as objective morality, nor does there have to be. Morality is the servant of society, not its ruler. I should say rather that specific ethical principles and moral rules, rather than some abstract concept of morality, are the servants of society. I would like to say that they serve to maximize the well-being of society, of humans in community. They seek to regulate the very complex business of people interacting with people. I would also like to say that this is about something like providing the greatest good for the greatest number. But it's difficult even to justify this as some kind of moral absolute. In a society where the majority of people are red and a minority blue, this principle could prove very bad for blue people. So there are other principles that we would need to draw upon. Sometimes Mr. Spock's "the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few," or the one, from Star Trek The Wrath of Khan, sometimes that will carry the day. But sometimes it will be Kirk's counter-proposal: the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many, in Star Trek The Search for Spock. Sometimes this will carry the day. There's no easy way towards morality. There's no quick and easy shortcut. We tend to think that whatever we currently hold as our highest value is a universal, immutable, and independent truth. But it never is. We also tend to think that such moral truths are self-evident, though they are not. Not even if we call our moral code a universal declaration of human rights. Even if it were such, it would still not be enough, because one day we may encounter the non-human, whether that's in the form of aliens who visit our planet or we visit theirs, or non-human intelligence that we build here among us.